You will be a whole different person in 2 weeks. Trust me when I say this, a lot of people are about to have their come up. And if you've been spiritual all along, not performative, but genuinely paying attention, these may be your weeks. And what's strange is, this probably won't look how you expected. There's something strange about these first 2 weeks of June that I think spiritually attuned people will understand immediately once they feel it. You may start feeling early, not behind, not disconnected, early, like looking around and quietly thinking, wait, people seriously haven't noticed this yet? On the surface, everything still looks normal. Your routine hasn't exploded. People haven't changed overnight. Nothing dramatic happened. But you feel different inside of it because you already accepted something that other people are still waiting to discover. And they may even look at you as if you are crazy, but in reality, you're just early, and that's the plot twist. Because most of the time, being early feels confusing. It feels like seeing possibility before there's enough evidence to explain it. But you will be past that point soon. There's a question hidden inside these first 2 weeks of June that I think a lot of spiritually attuned people are going to run into unexpectedly. And once you notice it, it becomes difficult to ignore. What part of your future only exists to impress your past? Because sometimes we think we're moving forward when really we're still negotiating with old versions of ourselves. Maybe you wanted success because years ago you felt overlooked. Maybe you wanted recognition because at one point you felt behind. Maybe you wanted a certain life because you thought finally reaching it would settle something inside you. But what happens when you realize you've changed before the goal did? That's what makes this period interesting. You may notice yourself becoming less attached to things that used to feel huge, not because you lost ambition, but because your reasons changed. And that can feel confusing at first because people expect growth to feel exciting. Sometimes growth feels like becoming uninterested in proving things. These first weeks of June don't feel like they're asking you to dream bigger. They feel like they're asking you to become more honest about what actually deserves your energy. Because there's a difference between building a future and trying to win an argument with your past. Not every dream is meant to be achieved. Some are meant to reveal who you no longer are. And once you realize that, you stop forcing things and start moving differently. Something unusual that may happen during these first weeks of June is that you become quieter about the things you care about the most. Not because you're scared, not because you doubt yourself. Actually, the opposite. You may notice that when something starts feeling real, you suddenly stop feeling the need to explain it. Plans that excite you don't feel urgent to announce. Good moments stop feeling incomplete just because nobody saw them. Ideas stop needing approval before they even exist. And at first, that can feel strange, because people usually associate confidence with expression. They think confidence means speaking loudly, showing progress, sharing every step, and making sure people understand what's happening. But there's another kind of confidence that shows up later, the kind that doesn't rush to prove itself, the kind that trusts momentum more than attention. And I think these weeks carry that feeling, like something inside you already knows where this is going. So instead of spending energy talking about it or trying to make it feel real through other people's reactions, you'd rather spend that energy building it. Because when something finally starts feeling aligned, you stop needing immediate confirmation. You become less interested in hearing "that's amazing" and more interested in actually seeing where it leads. That's not secrecy, that's trust. That's understanding that not every good thing needs to be exposed at the earliest stage. People often think keeping things private means you're uncertain. But sometimes people stay quiet because certainty finally arrived. You stop treating every new possibility like something fragile that needs validation to survive. You start treating it like something solid enough to grow on its own. And there's something powerful about that shift because you realize how much energy gets wasted trying to make unfinished things look finished. These first weeks feel different. They feel like protecting momentum, protecting excitement, protecting things before they become obvious. Not because you fear sabotage, but because you respect timing. Some things become real faster when they stay close to the heart, and for a lot of spiritually attuned people, these weeks don't feel like receiving permission. They feel like realizing you never needed it in the first place. One of the strangest things that may happen during these first weeks of June is that you stop being impressed by things that used to completely capture your attention. And before you think that sounds sad, empty, or disconnected, I actually think it's one of the most positive signs in this entire period, because most people are taught that a better life means adding more excitement, more experiences, more attention, more plans, more people, more reasons to feel important. There's this constant idea that fulfillment should feel intense and obvious. But what if one of the clearest signs that you're entering a better chapter isn't that life becomes louder? What if it's that your standards become quieter? You may notice yourself becoming less interested in proving things, less excited by things that only look good from the outside, less willing to say yes just because something feels rare or impressive. And that can feel confusing at first because people often mistake peace for boredom. But they're not the same thing. Boredom is when nothing feels meaningful. Peace is when fewer things need to be. That's the difference. You start preferring conversations that actually stay with you instead of interactions that disappear the second they end. You start appreciating people who make you feel calm instead of people who constantly make life feel urgent. You become more interested in depth than volume. And something surprising happens when that shift begins. Life doesn't become smaller, it becomes easier to enjoy. You stop treating every experience like it needs to become a memory, a lesson, a breakthrough, or a story. You stop turning every good thing into a goal and every goal into pressure. You begin allowing things to simply be good. And I think that's part of what these first weeks are trying to show spiritually attuned people. You may realize that the version of you that wanted everything was not actually greedy. Maybe they were just searching. But now something feels different. Now you don't want more. You want alignment. You want things that fit. You want things that stay. You want things that still feel right after the excitement disappears. And there's something unexpectedly beautiful about that. Because once you stop trying to collect experiences, achievements, moments, and validation just to feel alive, life starts giving you experiences that actually reach you. You don't feel empty because something disappeared. You feel spacious because something unnecessary left. And maybe that's the gift. Not becoming someone who wants less, becoming someone who finally understands what deserves to be wanted. And now it's time for today's comment of the day. Big dreams need big sacrifices. If it scares you and excites you at the same time, that's your gut telling you to go for it. Because the things that truly matter rarely feel completely comfortable. There's usually that strange mix of emotions, the excitement of possibility, and the fear of leaving what's familiar. And that feeling can be confusing at first. But sometimes fear isn't telling you to stop. Sometimes it's just showing you that what's ahead actually matters to you. And I like that this comment doesn't say to chase every impulse. It points to something different, that moment where part of you feels nervous, but another part of you already knows. There's something interesting about June 9th that I don't think gets talked about enough. People always hear about fortunate timing and immediately assume that means saying yes to whatever appears. More opportunities, more options, more excitement, more doors opening. But what if that's not abundance? What if abundance is being able to choose? Because this day feels less like life bringing one giant opportunity and more like life placing multiple attractive things in front of you and quietly watching what you do. You may suddenly feel drawn towards something that looks exciting, looks rewarding, looks beautiful, looks promising. And maybe it is. But this part matters. Not every opportunity arrives because it belongs in your future. Some opportunities arrive to reveal whether you've changed. That's why spiritually attuned people may experience this period differently. You may notice yourself becoming more selective, not closed off, not fearful, just harder to impress. You stop asking, "Can I have this?" and start asking, "Do I even want this?" That shift is powerful because for a long time people think freedom means keeping every option open. But eventually you realize that constantly choosing everything is another form of being controlled. There's a quiet confidence in recognizing that something can be good and still not be for you. Abundance is not having access to everything. It is having the clarity to leave what no longer deserves you. And there's something beautiful about that, because choosing less starts feeling less like missing out and more like finally respecting where your energy is meant to go. There's one possibility about these first weeks of June that I think a lot of spiritually attuned people miss completely because it doesn't arrive in the way they imagined. What if the thing you've been trying to attract didn't suddenly begin during these 2 weeks? What if it quietly started moving toward you a long time ago because people expect progress to feel obvious? But most of the time, that isn't how it works. Life has this strange habit of changing underneath you first and only becoming visible later. That opportunity you thought disappeared. That habit that became easier without you noticing. Sometimes what you call waiting was actually movement the entire time. And I think these first weeks of June carry that energy, not arrival, recognition. You may suddenly realize that something you thought was far away has already entered your life in smaller forms, not as the final version, but enough to prove that movement already started. And if you can't see it yet, I want you to consider something. Maybe it isn't absent. Maybe it became normal. That's the weird thing about receiving something after wanting it for a long time. Once it becomes part of your reality, your brain stops treating it like a victory. You adapt. You move on. You forget to look. But spiritually attuned people may notice this period gives them a second look, a chance to realize, wait, this actually started months ago. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm already inside it. What makes these first weeks of June feel so interesting is that they don't feel complete. They feel like the beginning of a shift that hasn't fully shown itself yet. And I think that's why the days leading into the new moon feel important, not because they promise dramatic change, but because they create this strange sense that the way you've been approaching life is starting to become outdated. Not wrong, just too small for what's next. People hear new phase and immediately imagine the usual things, new relationships, new routines, new habits. But I don't think this feels like that. I think this feels more like entering rooms you didn't know existed, realizing there are ways of thinking, moving, choosing, and experiencing life that never even crossed your mind before because you were busy trying to improve the old version. That's what makes this period exciting. It doesn't feel like upgrading your current life. It feels like discovering life had more categories than you thought. You may notice things becoming interesting that never used to matter. You may find yourself thinking bigger, but in a calmer way. You may stop trying to optimize every outcome and start becoming curious again. That's a different energy, because curiosity expands people faster than pressure does. And maybe that's what these first weeks are doing, not giving answers, creating space, making room for things that don't fit your old expectations. The next phase of life rarely arrives as more. It usually arrives as different. That's why I wouldn't rush these days, because by the time this new moon arrives, the most interesting thing may not be what entered your life. It may be realizing that you became someone capable of noticing things you would have ignored before. Something that I think becomes unusually common during these first weeks of June, especially for people who have been paying attention to themselves for a long time. You start being honest before you even realize you're doing it. Not dramatic honesty, not life-changing confessions. I mean those moments where somebody asks you something simple and your real answer comes out before the version of you that usually edits itself has time to intervene. You stop pretending certain things matter when they don't. You stop acting impressed by things that only look impressive. You stop saying, "I'll think about it," when deep down you already know your answer. And what's interesting is that it doesn't feel rebellious. It feels easier. Because most people don't realize how much energy they spend trying to maintain versions of themselves they quietly outgrew. They keep old goals because they've already announced them. They keep old interests because they've been associated with them for too long. They keep reacting in familiar ways because people expect consistency. But these weeks feel different. They feel like they remove the extra layer. You may notice yourself saying things like, "I actually don't care about that anymore. I don't want to force that. I don't need that to feel successful." And instead of feeling guilty, it feels clean. Because honesty isn't always saying more. Sometimes honesty is finally stopping the performance, and something unexpected starts happening once that distance closes. Your decisions become faster. Your attention becomes sharper. You stop wasting energy trying to convince yourself to want things that already expired. That's why I think accidental honesty is powerful. Not because it changes who you are overnight, because it reveals who was already there underneath all the editing. When I look at these first 2 weeks of June, I honestly don't think the biggest thing happening is outside of you. I think the biggest thing is that you may stop needing life to convince you, and that changes more than people realize. Because most people imagine change as this huge visible event. They imagine there's going to be a day where everything clicks into place, uncertainty disappears, and life finally gives them permission to believe that something good is happening. They imagine some undeniable moment where they finally feel ready. But if you really think about your own life, that's usually not how the important things started. Most of the moments that changed, you didn't feel important at first. They looked ordinary while they were happening. They began with a different way of thinking, a decision that seemed small at the time, a feeling that something no longer fit, or a quiet realization that only made sense months later. That's why I think these first weeks of June matter so much, not because there's one huge event hidden inside them, and not because there's some perfect answer waiting at the end. I think they matter because they slowly remove the belief that you need life to arrive in a dramatic way before allowing yourself to trust where you're going. Because once you stop waiting for the perfect sign, something unexpected starts happening. You begin noticing that you've already changed. You notice that your standards changed without effort. You notice that things that used to feel impossible now feel achievable. You notice that your relationship with the future became calmer, and instead of feeling like life begins later, you start feeling like life has already been happening while you were busy waiting for certainty. And that realization changes everything. You stop treating yourself like a waiting room for some future version of yourself that finally has permission to live. You stop acting like your real chapter starts after one more breakthrough, one more confirmation, one more moment where all doubts disappear. Because maybe that moment was never coming. Not because life forgot you, but because life was never asking for certainty. Maybe it was asking whether you could trust yourself before certainty arrived. And if you're still here, I want to truly thank you for watching. Maybe this season isn't asking you to do more or become more. Maybe it's asking you to be more honest. Honest about what gives you energy, what you've outgrown, and what you no longer need to carry. Sometimes it's realizing you react differently, need less approval, or stop forcing what no longer fits. Whatever these first weeks of June are bringing, give yourself space to notice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.